In the minutes after the fight, the space remained frozen. No one rushed forward. No one spoke. They had not witnessed a sparring match. They had not witnessed a demonstration. They had witnessed certainty die in real time. The Japanese champion stood silently, chest still aching, breath still uneven, but something far deeper than bruised ribs had been struck. Years of conditioning had taught him how to endure pain. What he was experiencing now was something else entirely. Disorientation. The collapse of a worldview. The unsettling awareness that mastery, as he understood it, had limits he had never imagined. Around them, instructors whispered. Fighters stared. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others leaned forward, desperate to understand what they had just seen. Because nothing about that fight fit the framework they knew. There had been no prolonged exchange. No dramatic flurry. No savage brawl. Just control. Timing. Precision. And inevitability. Bruce Lee returned to the corner of the gym and sat down quietly, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. No raised fists. No triumphant gestures. No acknowledgement of the stunned crowd gathering around him. For Bruce, the fight was already over. For everyone else, it was just beginning. Within minutes, the story spread like wildfire through the tournament. Whispers turned into urgent conversations. Conversations turned into arguments. Arguments turned into questions no one was prepared to answer. A Japanese karate champion, defeated. In under 2 minutes. Not by brute force, but by something they could not define. Some dismissed it immediately. They said the match was unofficial. They said the champion underestimated Bruce. They said the conditions were unfair. They said it wasn't real karate. But none of those explanations could erase what hundreds of trained martial artists had just witnessed with their own eyes. The Japanese delegation withdrew into themselves. Their confidence, once unshakable, now cracked. Not destroyed, but shaken enough to be dangerous. Because once doubt enters a system built on certainty, it never truly leaves. Meanwhile, Bruce became the center of quiet gravity. People approached him cautiously. Not with bravado. With curiosity. They asked questions. Why didn't you use traditional stances? Why didn't you block? Why didn't you finish him earlier? Bruce answered simply. Because fighting is not about showing technique. It's about eliminating unnecessary movement. About seeing what is actually happening. About being honest. Those answers unsettled people more than the fight itself. Because if Bruce was right, then years, decades, of training might need to be reconsidered. And that possibility terrified some. That night, away from the noise of the tournament, Bruce reflected alone. He did not replay the victory. He replayed the reactions. The shock. The confusion. The resistance. He had seen it before. The same look on faces when deeply held beliefs are challenged. He knew the fight would be talked about. Argued about. Distorted. He also knew something else. The fight was never meant to be a spectacle. It was meant to be a mirror. In the days that followed, instructors who had once dismissed Bruce began quietly attending his sessions. Not publicly. Not proudly. But earnestly. They watched how he trained. How he emphasized attributes over techniques. How he broke movements down to their essentials. They noticed something unsettling. Bruce did not contradict their arts. He stripped them down. He removed what was unnecessary. He sharpened what remained. And that made him dangerous, not as a fighter, but as a thinker. Some adopted his ideas. Slowly. Carefully. Others rejected them outright. Because accepting Bruce's philosophy required humility. It required admitting that perfection in form did not guarantee effectiveness in combat. Years later, when the legend of Long Beach 1967 was retold, details would blur. Names would change. Words would be added. Exaggerations would grow. But the core truth would remain. That day marked a shift. Before Long Beach, martial arts in America revolved around tradition, hierarchy, and rigid systems. After Long Beach, questions began to surface. What actually works? What is real fighting? What is unnecessary? Bruce Lee didn't answer all those questions. He simply made it impossible to ignore them. The Japanese champion returned to his dojo changed. Not publicly humbled, but privately transformed. He continued to teach karate, continued to respect its history, continued to honor its lineage. But he no longer taught it as complete. He taught it as a foundation. Because he had learned something that day that no kata had ever taught him. That adaptability is not a weakness. That structure without freedom becomes a cage. That fighting is not about loyalty to a system, but loyalty to truth. Years later, Bruce Lee would become a global icon. Films, interviews, philosophy, myth. But those who were there that day knew something the cameras never captured. Bruce Lee didn't become a legend because of movies. He became a legend because, in a quiet gymnasium, in under 2 minutes, he demonstrated something terrifyingly simple. That when illusion meets reality, reality always wins. And that was the moment martial arts stopped being about style and started being about effectiveness. That was Long Beach, 1967. And nothing was ever the same after. But history does not move forward cleanly. It resists. It argues. It fights back. In the weeks after Long Beach, the story fractured into versions. Some told it quietly, almost reverently. Others told it angrily, defensively, reshaping details to protect what they loved. Because when a belief system is threatened, people do not abandon it easily. They fortify it. Some claimed the Japanese champion had been tired. Others said he had been unfamiliar with American conditions. A few insisted the fight never truly happened at all. Bruce Lee heard none of it directly. He didn't respond. He didn't clarify. He didn't correct. He understood something most people didn't. Truth does not need defense. It reveals itself through impact. And the impact of that fight rippled outward, quietly at first, then unmistakably. Students began asking different questions in dojos across the country. Not louder questions. Dangerous ones. Why do we stand like this? Why do we train this way? What happens if the opponent doesn't cooperate? What happens if nothing goes according to plan? Instructors who had answers rooted in repetition suddenly found those answers unsatisfying. Because repetition explains how. But it does not explain why. Bruce Lee's influence spread not because he claimed superiority, but because he exposed gaps. He never said traditional martial arts were useless. He said something far more unsettling. That they were incomplete. And incompleteness is intolerable to those who were told they had reached mastery. At Long Beach, Bruce did not defeat a man. He defeated certainty. And certainty, once broken, cannot be repaired. Only replaced. Years later, fighters who had been in that crowd would describe a strange sensation they felt during the match. Not excitement. Not fear. Recognition. They said it felt like watching someone move without hesitation. Someone who did not think in techniques. Someone who responded instead of planned. Someone whose body seemed to answer questions before the mind finished asking them. That was what frightened them most. Bruce Lee wasn't faster because of genetics. He wasn't stronger because of size. He wasn't winning because of secret techniques. He was free. Free from the need to look correct. Free from loyalty to shape. Free from the comfort of routine. And freedom, in combat, is terrifying to face. The Japanese champion understood that the moment his punch missed and Bruce stood inside his guard. In that instant, time slowed. He saw the opening. He felt the vulnerability. He realized that all his structure had guided him perfectly into a trap. Structure had made him predictable. Bruce had no such problem. That was the real knockout. Not the punch to the chest. The realization that he had been fighting with rules the other man did not obey. That realization stays with a fighter forever. It creeps into training sessions. It whispers during drills. It surfaces in moments of doubt. And once it appears, you can never unsee it. Bruce Lee never claimed to invent something new. He claimed to remove what was unnecessary. And removal is far more threatening than addition. Because addition allows tradition to grow without changing. Removal demands sacrifice. It demands honesty. That is why Long Beach mattered. Not because of who fell, but because of what fell with him. The belief that one system could answer all questions. The belief that tradition guaranteed truth. The belief that mastery was an endpoint. Bruce Lee shattered those beliefs without raising his voice, without raising a fist for most of the fight, without even intending to humiliate. He simply allowed reality to speak. And reality spoke clearly. After Long Beach, martial arts would never fully return to what they were. Mixed approaches began to surface. Cross-training increased. Fighters experimented. Thinkers questioned. Decades later, the rise of modern combat sports would confirm what Bruce had already demonstrated in 2 minutes. That style does not win fights. Attributes do. Timing does. Adaptation does. Truth does. Bruce Lee did not live long enough to see how deeply that truth would spread. But on that day in 1967, in a quiet space away from the spotlight, he planted the seed. A seed that grew into a revolution. And that is why the fight matters. Not because Bruce Lee knocked out a Japanese karate champion, but because he knocked out the illusion that certainty equals strength. He proved that the future belongs not to those who cling to form, but to those who are willing to let go. That was Long Beach. That was Bruce Lee. And that was the moment martial arts woke up. And even after the crowd dispersed, even after the mats were cleared, even after the tournament continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened, the air in Long Beach never truly returned to normal. Something invisible had shifted. The fighters who stepped onto the floor later that day carried a new weight in their movements. Some overcompensated, throwing techniques harder, faster, as if power alone could protect them from doubt. Others hesitated, their confidence fractured by a question they could no longer silence. What if form is not enough? That question lingered. It followed people home. It entered dojos. It sat quietly in the back of training halls, watching repetition after repetition, asking the same thing again and again. Would this work if someone refused to play along? For the Japanese champion, the answer came in moments. In flashes. In memories that replayed themselves without permission. The moment Bruce slipped past the first punch. The moment his kick was intercepted before it became dangerous. The moment that 1-inch punch stopped, suspended in space, like a held breath. That was when the fight was already over. Not because of pain, but because of understanding. He had trained to dominate space. Bruce had trained to dissolve it. He had trained to impose will. Bruce had trained to read intention. He had trained to execute. Bruce had trained to respond. And response always arrives faster than execution. Back in his own country, the champion returned to teaching. On the surface, nothing changed. Classes began the same way. Pose. Discipline. Tradition. Kata performed with the same precision they always had. But something was different. He watched his students more closely now. Not just how perfectly they moved, but how they reacted when things went wrong. When timing was disrupted. When rhythm broke. When expectation failed. He began asking questions he had never asked before. What happens if the opponent doesn't step back? What happens if the distance collapses? What happens if you miss? He had no easy answers. Because easy answers belong to systems that promise certainty. And certainty had betrayed him. Meanwhile, Bruce Lee's name began circulating beyond Long Beach. Quietly at first. Among serious practitioners. Among people who didn't care about trophies or belts or politics. People who cared about one thing. Does it work? They sought Bruce out not because he claimed to be a master, but because he refused the title altogether. He called himself a student. A researcher. A fighter learning from experience rather than inheritance. That humility disarmed people. Because arrogance demands defense. Humility invites exploration. Bruce's training methods evolved rapidly after Long Beach. Not because the fight proved he was finished learning, but because it confirmed he was right to keep learning. He refined his footwork. He sharpened his timing. He simplified his techniques even further. Not more. Less. Every movement questioned. Every habit challenged. If something did not serve efficiency, it was discarded. No matter how beautiful. No matter how respected. No matter how ancient. That ruthless honesty became his signature. And it was born from moments like Long Beach. The fight itself faded into legend. Details distorted. Timelines blurred. Some denied it. Others mythologized it beyond recognition. But legends grow only where truth once stood. And the truth was simple. A man trained to obey structure met a man trained to transcend it. And structure broke. Not violently. Inevitably. Years later, when Bruce Lee spoke about fighting, he never referenced that day directly. He didn't need to. His philosophy carried the evidence within it. Absorb what is useful. Discard what is not. Add what is uniquely your own. Those words were not poetry. They were a warning. Because anyone who followed them honestly would eventually arrive at the same realization. That tradition is a guide, not a cage. That technique is a tool, not a law. That mastery is not a destination, but a process of constant shedding. Long Beach was not the beginning of that truth. But it was the moment it became impossible to ignore. And that is why the story refuses to die. Not because of the punch. Not because of the knockout. Not because of national pride. But because somewhere deep inside, everyone who hears it recognizes something unspoken. That we all cling to systems that make us feel safe. That we all fear discovering their limits. That we all secretly wonder what would happen if they failed. Bruce Lee answered that question in under 2 minutes. Not with words. Not with arrogance. But with clarity. And clarity, once experienced, cannot be forgotten. That was the true legacy of Long Beach, 1967. A moment when certainty fell. And truth stood quietly in its place. And long after the echoes of that day faded, long after the tournament banners were taken down and the mats rolled away, the question it raised continued to follow martial artists wherever they trained. Because once you have seen certainty fail, you can never fully trust it again. Students who had grown up believing in absolute answers began to notice cracks. They noticed how drills worked perfectly, until someone moved differently. How techniques felt powerful, until timing was disrupted. How confidence thrived, until unpredictability entered the room. And unpredictability is the one opponent tradition struggles to prepare you for. Bruce Lee understood this instinctively. He understood that real combat is not a test of memorization. It is not an exam where the correct answer is rewarded. It is chaos. It is pressure. It is adaptation under stress. That is why the fight at Long Beach mattered beyond the two men involved. It revealed a truth that many sensed but few dared to articulate. That mastery without adaptability is fragile. The Japanese champion did not lose because his karate was weak. He lost because it was complete only within its own boundaries. When those boundaries dissolved, so did his advantage. Bruce Lee had no boundaries to protect, and that freedom was his greatest weapon. Over time, the story became quieter but deeper. It stopped being shouted and started being studied. Instructors who once dismissed Bruce began to borrow ideas, sometimes without credit, sometimes without realizing where they came from. They added footwork drills. They emphasized timing over form. They encouraged controlled sparring that broke patterns. They didn't call it Jeet Kune Do, but they felt its influence. That is how real change spreads. Not through declarations. Through necessity. Bruce Lee never claimed to be the future of martial arts. He simply refused to be stuck in the past. And in doing so, he forced everyone else to choose. Cling to certainty. Or adapt to reality. Long Beach was not the loudest moment in martial arts history. It wasn't broadcast. It wasn't recorded for mass audiences. It didn't come with titles or trophies. But it was honest. And honesty has a way of surviving. Because whenever a fighter steps into a confrontation and realizes their training has not prepared them for what is happening, that moment feels familiar. Because somewhere, deep in the DNA of modern martial arts, that 2-minute lesson still exists. A reminder. That belts fade. That titles expire. That tradition, while valuable, is not invincible. Only truth is. Bruce Lee did not walk away from Long Beach as a champion with a medal around his neck. He walked away as something far more dangerous. A living question. A question that martial artists are still answering today. What happens when everything you know stops working? And the reason this story endures, long after the names blur and the details change, is because the answer Bruce gave was not comforting. It was liberating. He showed that growth begins where certainty ends. That freedom begins where rigidity fails. That real mastery is not about defending what you know, but about being willing to let it go. That was the real knockout. Not a punch. Not a fall. But the moment a belief hit the ground and did not get back up. That is why Long Beach, 1967, still matters. Because in 2 minutes, Bruce Lee didn't just change a fight. He changed the question. And once the question changes, nothing ever truly goes back to the way it was. And from that day forward, everyone who witnessed the fight, or heard about it, carried a spark of that realization. Even those who initially resisted it could not entirely ignore it. In the quiet corners of dojos, in the middle of intense sparring sessions, in moments of exhaustion, the memory of Bruce's movement resurfaced. The calm, fluid body that refused to be predictable, the timing that seemed almost prescient, the restraint that made every strike more powerful because it was chosen, not forced. It was no longer about belts or lineage. It was no longer about who had trained longer, or harder, or with more sacred masters. The fight had demonstrated that effectiveness was the only true measure of skill, and that truth does not care for tradition. The Japanese champion returned home changed. Publicly, he maintained his stature, continued to teach his students, and carried himself with the same pride he always had. But privately, everything shifted. He began incorporating new drills, questioning assumptions he had never questioned, and seeking understanding outside of rigid systems. He had tasted a glimpse of freedom within combat, and that hunger would not leave him. Bruce Lee, meanwhile, moved forward quietly, as he always did. He didn't seek headlines. He didn't demand recognition. The fight was never about proving dominance. It was a living lesson in principle: adapt, evolve, and face reality without fear or illusion. His philosophy, his approach to training, his very understanding of martial arts, became a seed that would grow far beyond the mats of Long Beach. In the decades that followed, as martial arts evolved across the globe, echoes of that moment could be found everywhere. Fighters began questioning rigid forms. Instructors incorporated more sparring, more unpredictability, more emphasis on adaptability rather than perfection. Styles that had been thought incompatible began to merge. Techniques that had been sacred were challenged. And the guiding question remained the same: does it work? Bruce Lee's fight at Long Beach 1967 became more than a legend. It became a philosophy in motion, an enduring truth about combat, about life, about mastery itself. The man who had once been dismissed as a showman demonstrated, in under 2 minutes, that control, adaptability, perception, and honesty in action mattered more than lineage, form, or reputation. The lesson transcended martial arts. It became a universal truth. To remain confined by rigid systems, to cling to what is comfortable or traditional, is to surrender the possibility of growth. True mastery requires courage, the courage to discard the familiar, the sacred, the expected, and embrace the unknown with precision, intent, and clarity. And that is why, more than 50 years later, people still tell the story. They tell it not for spectacle. They tell it because it resonates. Because we all recognize a version of ourselves in the Japanese champion, proud, trained, confident, yet suddenly confronted with the undeniable limits of what we know. And we all recognize a version of Bruce Lee within us, the potential to see clearly, move fluidly, and act decisively when the world refuses to bend to tradition. The Long Beach fight did not just reshape martial arts. It reshaped how the world thinks about mastery, about truth, about adaptability. It was a lesson in humility, in observation, in efficiency, in courage. And though the 2-minute fight has long since passed, its impact is immortal, because the ideas it revealed continue to unfold, challenging every martial artist, every thinker, every student who dares to look beyond what they have been taught. Bruce Lee did not just defeat a Japanese karate champion. He shattered illusions, dissolved rigid thinking, and left behind a legacy that is alive wherever skill meets reality. And that is why Long Beach 1967 remains more than a date, more than a tournament, more than a fight. It remains a turning point. A moment when tradition was confronted with truth, and truth proved undeniable, timeless, and eternal. And in the years that followed, the ripples of that 2-minute confrontation spread far beyond Long Beach. Stories of Bruce Lee's demonstration traveled from dojo to dojo, from city to city, from continent to continent. Some told it with awe, some with skepticism, some with envy, but everyone told it. Because the image of a man, smaller, younger, yet impossibly precise, dismantling an undefeated champion without malice, without theatrics, without cruelty, was unforgettable. Martial artists who had once measured themselves by form and lineage began to reconsider their definitions of mastery. They realized that perfection in technique meant nothing if it could not be applied under pressure, if it could not adapt to the unpredictable, if it could not respond to reality. Bruce Lee's philosophy was not just a challenge to tradition, it was a liberation from it. Even decades later, when modern combat sports began to flourish, the echoes of Long Beach could be seen in the cage, in the ring, and on the mat. Fighters who cross-trained, who experimented with new techniques, who sought efficiency over ceremony, were living proof of what Bruce had demonstrated in under 2 minutes. That rigid adherence to tradition, no matter how pure, could never substitute for honesty in combat. And yet, Bruce Lee's lesson was more than technical. It was deeply human. It showed that humility in skill is not weakness. That true strength is the ability to see through illusion and act decisively. That respect for others does not conflict with truth, it demands it. When Bruce helped the champion to his feet, he was not showing mercy. He was teaching the hardest lesson a martial artist can learn, that victory is meaningless without clarity, without understanding, without integrity. The Japanese champion carried that lesson for the rest of his life. He continued to teach, to train, to pass on the skills he had honed for decades, but now, every class included a whisper of Bruce's philosophy. Adaptation. Reading the opponent. Being like water. What was once unimaginable had become an essential part of understanding what fighting truly meant. Bruce Lee, meanwhile, continued his journey. He never rested on the laurels of Long Beach. He refined his art, distilled it further, sought deeper understanding, and shared it selectively with those willing to confront reality honestly. He became not only a fighter but a teacher, a philosopher, and a revolutionary force in martial arts. Long Beach 1967 was more than a fight. It was a turning point in history. Not just for martial arts, but for anyone willing to confront tradition, challenge assumptions, and embrace truth over comfort. It demonstrated that mastery is not the preservation of form, it is the pursuit of effectiveness. That innovation is not rebellion, it is survival. That courage is not aggression, it is honesty. And so, when we remember that day, we do not remember a punch landing. We do not remember a body hitting the mat. We remember something far more profound, the moment certainty met reality, and reality emerged undeniable. Bruce Lee did not just knock out a champion in 2 minutes. He knocked out complacency. He knocked out rigidity. He knocked out the illusion that tradition alone could contain truth. That is why the story endures. That is why Long Beach 1967 remains more than a tournament. That is why martial arts, even decades later, still carry the invisible imprint of that 2-minute lesson. Because true mastery, once glimpsed, can never be forgotten. And Bruce Lee did not just show mastery. He showed freedom. And freedom, once seen, never fades. And so, the final truth of Long Beach 1967 is simple, yet eternal. Bruce Lee did not fight that day to prove he was superior. He fought to reveal reality. To show that martial arts is not about the pride of a nation, the sanctity of a style, or the perfection of form. It is about truth, seeing it, adapting to it, living it in every strike, every step, every breath. The Japanese champion left the mats forever changed. His pride intact, but his understanding transformed. He returned to teaching, yes, but with a new philosophy. With humility. With adaptability. With honesty. What had once been sacred was now a tool, not a cage. What had once been tradition was now a foundation, not a ceiling. Bruce Lee walked away quietly, as he always did. No fanfare. No applause sought. The world may have only begun to understand his genius decades later, through films, writings, and the legacy of his students, but those who witnessed him that day understood something immediately. They had seen the future of fighting. They had seen truth in motion. 2 minutes. That was all it took. 2 minutes to shatter illusions, to challenge certainty, to inspire a revolution in thought and practice. 2 minutes to change the way the world would see martial arts forever. 2 minutes to teach a lesson that no dojo, no belt, no tournament ever could. Long Beach 1967 will be remembered not for the trophies, the banners, or the cheers. It will be remembered for the lesson. For the moment when Bruce Lee, with precision, calm, and insight, proved that real strength comes not from rigid tradition, but from clarity, adaptability, and the courage to embrace reality as it is. And that is why Bruce Lee is not remembered merely as a fighter, but as a teacher, a philosopher, a revolutionary. Because in 2 minutes, he didn't just defeat a champion. He changed the rules of fighting. He changed the hearts of those who watched. He changed the world. And the lesson lasts forever. Mastery is not about the past. It is not about lineage. It is not about pride. It is about truth. And those who understand it, like water, flow. Long Beach 1967, the day reality moved faster than tradition. The day Bruce Lee showed the world what fighting, what skill, what truth really is. The end.